My ex told the judge I was crazy. Then my 7-year-old played a video that changed everything. Never trust the smiles you see in front of the camera. I slept next to a demon for 8 long years. I used to call him my husband. I once thought he was my ideal partner. But then one night, when the mask finally slipped, I saw exactly who he really was. Brandon Walker, the real estate king, the perfect man, father of the year. Everybody knew him. Everybody admired him. Everyone believed I was the luckiest woman alive to be able to call him my husband. Until the night I dragged my daughter out of the mansion at 3 a.m. My breath was ragged. Blood trickled from the corner of my mouth. Sophie sobbed under the table like a tiny hunted creature. Brandon wasn't a successful businessman anymore. He wasn't wearing his expensive suits, and his charming smile had vanished. All that remained was a drunken man clutching a bottle of whiskey. His eyes bloodshot, screaming words I will never forget. "Don't think you can take my kid and leave me, Emily. Nobody's gonna believe you. No one's on your side." And he was right. Almost. I came so close to losing. Because out there, the world loves pretty stories. They like to think the wealthy are kind. They love to believe that a man who has everything must surely be a good man. They didn't know about the nights I curled up in bed while he smashed things downstairs. They didn't know about Sophie whispering through tears, asking, "Mom, does Dad hate me?" They didn't know, and they didn't want to know. It wasn't until everything collapsed, until Sophie, at just 7 years old, stood up in court and presented evidence, that the last mask was finally torn off. Brandon lost everything, and me, I lost my illusions. Maybe I finally found myself again. Now, as I sit alone in this small apartment, I've decided to tell everything. Not to complain, not to seek pity, but because if you're listening to me, you need to know. The devil doesn't live under your bed. He could be sitting right next to you, wearing his finest suit, calling you my love. And I'm about to tell you exactly how I exposed him. It all started like a dream. A mansion as grand as a castle, with marble walkways, Italian curtains, and weekend parties filled with wine and laughter from the upper class. Back then, Brandon was a star. He was charming, witty, and knew exactly how to make people feel special. I, a woman with a stable career, got swept up in his world just like that. I became Emily Walker, wife of Brandon Walker, and everyone thought I was lucky. But you know, some things are invisible to others. No one saw me asking for permission just to have lunch with my best friend. No one knew Brandon controlled everything, from the credit card passwords to how I raised Sophie. No one heard the soft-spoken yet razor-sharp words he used whenever he wanted me to act properly. I kept telling myself, it's okay, if I try hard enough, things will get better. Sophie was the reason I endured. She was the only light in that cold mansion. She loved her father, or rather, the image of him that she believed in. "Dad's always busy, but he's great, right, Mom?" I nodded, hiding the truth. That's how I thought I was protecting her. But I was wrong. The real nightmare only began when Brandon started to fail. A major deal fell through, and he, the man who once knew how to control his temper, stopped hiding his true nature. He drank more. He got angry more easily. Arguments no longer ended with words. I still remember that night clearly. Sophie was at the dining table, doing homework. Brandon came home drunk. I tried to keep things calm, but even a harmless question from me set him off. He smashed a glass, roared, and charged at me. Sophie screamed. I grabbed her and ran upstairs, slammed the door shut, and tried to comfort her as his shouts echoed from below. Sophie clung to me tightly, her innocent face soaked with tears. "Mom, I'm scared." Right at that moment, something inside me shattered. I knew I couldn't wait for Brandon to get better anymore. I knew if we stayed, next time might not just be words. The very next morning, while he was out meeting a client, I packed. Not much, just enough to get by. Sophie and I left the mansion, climbed into the car, and never looked back. As the car pulled away, Sophie asked, "Mom, where are we going?" I turned to her, my voice trembling. "Somewhere you'll never have to be afraid again." That was the day I reclaimed our freedom. Or at least, I thought I did. It's almost laughable now, thinking about how I used to believe everything was temporary. That Brandon, with all the stress and pressure from work, would eventually return to being the man I once knew. The man who used to be gentle, who used to hold my hand in the middle of crowded parties, who used to whisper in my ear, "You are the dream I've been searching for." But that dream had long since died. I was simply the last person to admit it. Everything started spiraling after Brandon lost a major contract. It wasn't a soft fall, it was a collapse. A luxury project got canceled at the last minute. Investors turned their backs. And suddenly, the man once hailed as a real estate genius became the laughingstock at the upper-class cocktail parties. Brandon couldn't handle that. He started drinking, heavily. At first, it was just a glass of whiskey after dinner, but soon it became the second bottle, then the third. I would wake up at 3 a.m. and find him sitting alone in the pitch-black living room, empty-eyed, gripping his drink. During the day, he kept his calm facade. He was still the charming Brandon when meeting clients. But at night, when the mansion doors closed, the nightmare began. I became his emotional punching bag. Every word I said could be a trigger. "Why are you drinking so much tonight?" A fight. Please don't yell. Sophie is studying. Objects flying across the room. Can you lower your voice a little? A phone hurled straight into the wall, missing my head by inches. But the worst part wasn't the shattered objects. It was the look in Sophie's eyes every time it happened. She learned to flinch when she heard glass break. She learned to cover her ears when her father started shouting. She learned to quietly go to bed when the air turned heavy and suffocating. I used to think I was shielding her, but I was wrong. She felt it all. That night, the night everything shattered, Brandon had drunk far too much. I can't even remember what started it. Maybe I had simply dared to ask him to turn off the TV because Sophie needed to sleep early. He threw the remote across the room, jumped up, and pointed straight at my face. His eyes were bloodshot, and his words reeked of alcohol and hatred. Who do you think you are? You live off me, Emily. Without me, you're nothing. Don't think you can take my kid anywhere. Not happening. Sophie, sitting curled up on the staircase, covered her face and cried. Seeing her like that, something inside me broke completely. No more fear, no more hope that Brandon would ever change. Just one brutal truth. If I didn't get my child out of there, next time might end in tragedy. When Brandon stormed into the bedroom, slamming the door to unleash his rage on something else, I knew my window had opened. I packed as quickly as I could. No money, no valuables. Just one small bag with essential documents, a few clothes, Sophie's medicine, and Sophie herself. I stepped into her room. She was still sitting on her bed, tears streaming down her face. Sweetheart, I whispered. Put on your coat. We're leaving right now. She didn't ask why. She simply nodded, wiped her tears, and pulled on her hoodie. I grabbed her hand tightly, and we tiptoed down the stairs. The TV was still blaring, and Brandon was still yelling at someone on the phone. I opened the front door. For the first time in years, I didn't look back. Once we got into the car, I buckled Sophie in. She stayed silent, only her heavy breathing filling the space. As we drove away from the familiar street, I heard her voice, small and shaky. Mom, where are we going? I looked in the rearview mirror, my eyes blurred with tears. But this time, they weren't from fear. I cried because I knew this was the end of the nightmare. I answered, my voice hoarse but resolute, to a place where you'll never have to be afraid again. That night, I left behind more than just the mansion. I left behind my illusions about family, about the man I once trusted. When the mansion door closed behind me for the last time, I knew that from that moment on, I was no longer Brandon Walker's wife. I was just Emily. A mother. A woman willing to do whatever it takes to keep her daughter safe. I used to think that once Sophie and I left that mansion, we were free. I was naive. Because nightmares don't end when you slam a door shut behind you. They begin when the villain decides you're not allowed to live in peace. We were living in a tiny apartment in an ordinary neighborhood. People went to work in the mornings and drank beers on their porches at night. There were no screams here, no broken glass, no little eyes constantly watching a drunken father's shadow. Just Sophie and me. Peace. Even though we were poorer and counting every penny. Still, peace was the most precious thing I had, until the first letter arrived. It wasn't long, just a few printed pages from the city's most prestigious law firm. But every word cut through me like a blade. Petition for full custody. Defendant, Emily Parker. Allegation, unable to provide a stable environment and exhibiting signs of causing emotional distress to a minor. I sank to the floor, feeling as though someone had crushed my lungs. Brandon. He didn't just want Sophie back. He wanted to erase me from her life. The months that followed became a new kind of nightmare. Quieter, but no less cruel. This one was calculated. It was strategic. Brandon painted the perfect picture in court. The devoted father. A businessman who balanced work and family. A man who once had a happy home until his unstable wife ruined everything. He hired one of the city's top attorneys, the kind whose consultation fees alone were double my rent. They knew how to twist every word. They knew how to make me, a single mom living in a modest apartment, look like a failure. At the very first hearing, I saw exactly where I stood in society's eyes. Brandon's lawyer began softly, almost kindly. Emily is a good person. No one denies that. But sometimes being good isn't enough. She lacks stability. Her job is inconsistent. Her living situation is unsuitable. And most importantly, she frequently becomes emotional in front of the child. Emotional? They turned my worried tears into weapons against me. And Brandon? He sat in court in a sleek gray suit, hair perfectly combed. When speaking to the judge, he used we, as if we were still a team. When talking about Sophie, he said, she is my entire world. He knew exactly how to win the crowd. And they believed him. Old friends began avoiding me. Neighbors who once smiled now whispered behind my back. I heard she's deeply depressed. When I picked Sophie up from school, I could feel the parents' judgmental stares. I overheard the cruel, hushed comments. Poor Sophie, having to live with such an unstable mother. I cried. Not for them, but for Sophie. I was terrified she would grow up under that cloud of pity. Terrified she would believe her mother was weak, broken, and not good enough. Sophie didn't talk much about it, but I knew she felt it too. One evening, after a brutal day in court, she sat beside me on the bed and asked quietly, Mom, Do people think I should live with Dad? I swallowed the lump in my throat and forced myself to answer. Not because they know us, sweetheart. Sometimes, people just choose to believe what's easier to hear. I started documenting everything. Threatening texts from Brandon, times he yelled at Sophie over the phone, I saved it all. But deep down, I knew. The court didn't just care about the truth. It cared about who told the better story. And Brandon was a master storyteller. I didn't know if I could win. I truly didn't. But when I looked at Sophie, so strong, so silent, far too mature for her age, I knew one thing. I wouldn't let him take the most precious thing from me. Not with money, not with lies. Not by turning me into a ghost in my own daughter's eyes. Even if I had to drag my exhausted body into court every single time, I would fight. But what I didn't expect was that the one to change everything wouldn't be me. It would be Sophie. And that moment, the moment she stood up, would forever shift the course of our story. Some changes come so quietly, so softly, that you don't even realize they've happened until everything is different. After the second hearing, I had almost grown used to being seen as the weak one. Brandon dominated everywhere. In the courtroom, in the judge's eyes, even in the hallways where other parents whispered about me. He was too good at crafting an image. Me, I was the opposite, exhausted, sleep-deprived, and constantly on the verge of tears. But there was one person who wasn't convinced by his performance. Sophie. She had remained so quiet. Sometimes so quiet, I thought she had resigned herself to the idea that this was just our life now, small, judged, and fragile. But no, Sophie wasn't giving up. She was simply watching. It started with small things. One evening after dinner, I was washing dishes in the kitchen. Sophie sat at the table, but instead of drawing like she usually did, she held her little tablet, the kind made for kids, and was quietly doing something. I didn't think much of it. Maybe a game or a video, I thought. But a few days later, I caught her sneaking around with my old phone, the one I no longer used, trying to record a video. When I asked, Sophie just smiled and brushed it off. I just wanted to practice filming. I didn't think much of it. What's there to worry about with a 7-year-old playing around, right? But then the questions began. Questions that didn't sound like the ones she used to ask. Mom, what if adults lie? What if someone scares others but acts nice in front of people? If I tell the truth and no one believes me, does that mean I should stay quiet? I froze when I heard those. Clearly, Sophie was thinking far deeper than I ever realized. She wasn't just witnessing what was happening, she was analyzing it. She was trying to understand how her father could turn everyone into fans, while turning her mother, the one always by her side, into a failure in the eyes of the world. And then one night, when I thought she was asleep, I heard faint clicking sounds coming from her room. I opened the door gently. She was sitting on her bed, the soft glow of her tablet lighting up her small face. Sophie was rewatching a video. I froze. It was Brandon. In the video, he was drunk, shouting into the phone, spewing venom about me, just like all those nights I had endured. Sophie turned to me, not panicked, not crying. Mom, I recorded it when Dad didn't know, because I thought maybe someday you'd need to prove you weren't lying. I didn't know what to say. Emotions swelled up in my throat, not just because my child had thought that far ahead, but because I realized, all this time, I believed I was the only one carrying the burden. But Sophie had been fighting too, in her own way. From that moment on, I started noticing more. Sophie became more careful with what she listened to and recorded. I didn't push her. I didn't interfere. Part of me was scared she was carrying too much for someone her age. But another part knew she was doing what I no longer had the strength to do. She didn't complain. She didn't cry or ask why this was happening. She just quietly kept going, recording, saving proof, like a little soldier, silently gathering every fragment of truth. And then one evening, right before the next hearing, as I was sorting through documents, Sophie sat down next to me. She looked at me for a long moment, then spoke softly. Mom, if Dad lies again next time, I think I can help you. I turned to her slowly. How can you help me, sweetheart? Sophie held up her tablet, handed it to me. Inside were videos, short but enough. Enough to reveal Brandon's true colors. She smiled, a sad but determined smile. I think the truth should be said by someone. Right, Mom? I couldn't hold back my tears. No one taught her to do this. No one told her she had to carry this responsibility. But Sophie, the 7-year-old girl who once cowered in the shadows of that luxurious mansion, had become the unexpected one. She wasn't just watching anymore. She had chosen to act. And in that moment, I knew. No matter what happened tomorrow in court, I was no longer fighting alone. It was a gray morning, though not a single cloud hung in the sky. The cold felt literal and metaphorical. I still remember exactly how it felt walking into the courthouse that day. My legs heavy, my stomach knotted tight. I gripped Sophie's hand tightly, though if I'm honest, I needed her more than she needed me. Brandon had arrived early. He stood there, dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit, his tie crisp, looking like he had stepped straight out of a magazine for successful dads. He smiled at his lawyer, shook hands with old acquaintances. To him, this wasn't a battle. This was just another meeting before lunch. I stood there in my simplest dress, hair pulled back neatly, no makeup, no flair. And somehow, that made me seem even weaker. People don't want the truth. They want someone strong enough to believe in. And that day, Brandon was that someone. The hearing began with Brandon's lawyer, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a voice so smooth it felt like every word had been rehearsed the night before. Your Honor, we do not deny that Mrs. Emily is a well-meaning mother. But the truth is, good intentions do not create stability, temporary housing, unstable employment, emotionally fragile, with a history of mental strain post-divorce, and most importantly, she has created confusion for the child by constantly speaking ill of the father. I sat there, every word cutting through me like a blade. My lawyer pushed back, pointing out the holes in their narrative, but I could read the judge's face. She was leaning, and not toward me. Then Brandon stood up. He looked right at me as he spoke. I don't want to take my daughter from Emily. I truly don't. But my daughter, she needs stability. She needs a father who can provide a peaceful life. This isn't about revenge, it's about what's best for my child. At that moment, I wanted to scream. To shout that this man, the drunk, the abuser, the one who terrorized us, was the real danger. But my lawyer gently placed a hand over mine, giving me a small shake of the head. Stay calm. Do not give them a reason to call me unstable. So I sat there, silent, as Brandon painted me as insane. The hearing dragged on all morning. Brandon's lawyer presented text messages, perfectly trimmed and twisted. My desperate words, said in moments of exhaustion like, I can't take this anymore, or I'm really confused, were turned into proof of my instability. And the nights Sophie cried after returning from his place, brushed aside, because without evidence, they were just stories. I knew. I felt it. The scale had tipped. The judge looked at me, then at Brandon. She didn't say it aloud, but everyone knew. If it ended right then and there, I would lose Sophie. I lowered my head, swallowing back tears. Not for myself, for my daughter. I had failed. I couldn't protect her from the nightmare that was her own father. But just as I thought everything was over, a small voice broke the silence. Your Honor. The entire courtroom froze. I looked up. Sophie. She had stood up, clutching her little tablet in her hands. I think everyone should see this. I could barely breathe as Sophie stepped forward. No fear, no hesitation. Brandon's face went pale instantly. His lawyer whispered something frantic into his ear. Sophie stood at the front. Her small hands offered the tablet to the court staff. This is a video I recorded. Dad didn't know I was filming, but he said really bad things. I don't know if adults believe Mom or not, but I think if they hear it from Dad himself, they'll understand. No one spoke. The judge ordered the video to be played. The courtroom fell into utter silence as Brandon's voice filled the room. Not the Brandon in the suit, the real Brandon, drunk, furious, spitting threats, and talking about me like I was garbage. When the video ended, the room stayed dead quiet. Brandon scrambled to stand up, stammering, "That was taken out of context. I was just disciplining her." But the judge wasn't buying it. "That's enough, Mr. Walker. Sit down." I sat there frozen. I couldn't believe what I had just witnessed. Sophie, the 7-year-old I thought I needed to protect, had just saved me. That was when everything turned. Brandon was no longer the perfect father. He became living proof that some people hide their true faces until their own children reveal them. And me? I looked at Sophie, trying to smile through my tears. Not tears of pain, tears of pride. She had grown far more than I ever realized. And because of her, I had been given back the chance I thought I had lost. No one in that courtroom moved right after the video ended. No one dared to. The last sound hanging in the suffocating air was Brandon's voice, from the recording, shouting, cursing at me and Sophie, using words he never let slip beyond the walls of that mansion. But now it was here, out in the open, under the light of truth. I remember that feeling vividly. Everything seemed frozen. I didn't cry, I didn't hyperventilate, I just sat there, still, partly from shock, but more so because I realized all the effort Brandon had poured into building his perfect image had crumbled in just a few minutes. The judge was the first to break the silence. Mr. Walker, do you have anything to say regarding this recording? Brandon, still trying to cling to whatever power he had left, stood up, his voice shaky. I was just trying to teach her how to behave. That was out of context. Emily, she must have made her record it to humiliate me. He stammered. He panicked. This wasn't the Brandon I once knew. Not the man who controlled every situation. Not the real estate king with the charming smile. This was Brandon exposed. An abuser, a manipulator, and now utterly defenseless. The judge cut him off, her voice cold as steel. I don't need your opinion on parenting, Mr. Walker. What I just heard is enough to determine that environment is not suitable for a child. His lawyer tried to object. Uselessly. The tide had turned. There was no more perfect father left to believe in. Sophie returned to her seat. She looked tired, maybe a little drained, but there was a strange steadiness in her eyes. I pulled her into my arms, holding her tight, and in that moment, I felt it. Sophie had grown. Too soon, too fast, in ways no child should ever have to. But she had done something I couldn't. She had spoken the truth when everyone else turned away. Are you okay? I whispered. She nodded, no words needed. She knew, and I knew. We had won, not just legally, but because finally, the truth had been heard. The judge issued a temporary ruling right then and there. Temporary full custody will be granted to Mrs. Emily Parker. Mr. Brandon Walker will have supervised visitation only, pending further investigation into emotional abuse allegations. I exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. It wasn't the end, but it was the beginning of Brandon's end. He stood there, stiff, like the life had been drained out of him. No more smiles, no more confidence, only shame and fear. He knew. Even with his money, his fancy lawyers, his big house, his luxury cars, he had lost. Not lost to me, lost to a 7-year-old child, the one brave enough to say what adults refused to. As court adjourned, I led Sophie out. No one cheered, no one clapped. But I felt the change in the air. There were subtle nods from people who once doubted me. There were quiet glances of respect directed towards Sophie, even if she didn't realize it. Outside the courthouse, I knelt down, placing my hands on her small shoulders. You know, Sophie, you did something I couldn't. You were brave. She looked up at me, her eyes still a little weary but shimmering with something else, something like hope. I just didn't want to be scared anymore, she said, voice as soft as the wind. I hugged her tightly. Not just out of love, but because, for the first time in a long, long time, I knew we were truly safe. Sophie was no longer the little girl hiding under the table. She had become the unexpected one, and she had saved us both. 4 weeks after that hearing, I got the call I had both longed for and dreaded. The judge had reached her final decision. That morning, I could barely breathe. Sophie sat at the kitchen table, drawing, doing her best to keep everything normal. She had grown far beyond her years. She understood, but also knew the only thing we could do was wait. The clock on the wall moved slower than ever. When the phone finally rang, I almost dropped it. My lawyer's voice was calm, without any dramatics. Emily, you've been granted full custody. Brandon Walker will only be allowed supervised visits twice a month at the family center. No private time. No decision-making rights regarding Sophie. I didn't respond right away. I just closed my eyes, letting the tears fall. But this time, they didn't come from pain. They came from liberation. Brandon, I later learned, had fought until the bitter end. He denied everything, claimed the video was edited, said I manipulated our daughter against him. But this time, his lies carried no weight. The truth, once exposed, had a power of its own. The court psychologist's report painted the full picture of Brandon, a controlling man, prone to emotional abuse, lacking basic empathy for his child. It was the final nail in the coffin of the story he had directed for years. I remember that day vividly, holding Sophie's hand as we walked out of the courthouse. No cheers. No applause. But the air felt different. I no longer kept my head down to avoid the stares. I held it high, not out of pride, but because finally we were no longer suffocated by lies. A woman, I didn't know her, passed by and whispered softly, "You and your daughter are so brave." I didn't know what to say. I just smiled and squeezed Sophie's hand tighter. That afternoon, we went out to eat. Not a fancy restaurant, no candles, no complicated dishes. Just a small diner Sophie loved, with old red chairs and animal-shaped pancakes she had adored since she was little. She sat across from me, stirring her chocolate milk, her eyes lighter now, as though the heavy burden had finally been lifted from her small shoulders. "Mom, is it really over now?" she asked, her voice hopeful yet cautious. I didn't lie. Nothing is ever truly over. But this time felt different. "Yes, baby. From now on, we're safe." Sophie smiled. A full, genuine smile I hadn't seen in months. She picked up her fork and ate her pancakes, letting out a soft sigh of relief, like she had finally taken off the heavy backpack she'd been carrying for too long. I looked at her, my heart overflowing with gratitude. Sophie, the child I thought I needed to protect, had been the one who saved us both. That night, after the city had gone quiet, I sat alone in our small living room. No shouting, no breaking glass, just the ticking clock and the soft glow of a warm lamp. I stared out the window. The world outside still rushed on, but inside this apartment, everything was finally peaceful. Sophie had fallen asleep. Before drifting off, she taped a small drawing on the wall. 2 hands holding each other, beneath them written, "Truth is brave." I stared at those words for a long time. Yes, truth is brave. Brave in the way a 7-year-old stood when every adult looked away. Brave in the way I chose to walk away from the mansion's lies. Most of all, brave in the choice to live honestly, even when the world didn't want to hear it. Brandon once held everything: money, power, influence. But tonight, I knew. He had lost. Not on paper, not just in court, but in the fact that he no longer controlled the narrative. For the first time in years, this story was mine, ours, Sophie's and mine. And together, we would write the next chapter. On our own terms, free and unafraid. Freedom. It sounds simple, doesn't it? Just not being controlled anymore, no more tiptoeing, no more fearing every footstep in the middle of the night. But for me, freedom used to feel impossibly far away. For years, I lived inside the mold Brandon built for me, the agreeable wife, the mother who kept quiet to maintain peace. Emily, the woman everyone thought had it all, while inside she was hollowed out by endless emptiness. And then, it all crumbled. Yet strangely enough, when the truth finally shattered everything, I didn't feel victorious. There were no cheers, no cinematic moment of triumph. There was only one thing left: peace. The weeks after the final hearing passed slowly. No more threatening emails from Brandon's lawyer, no more midnight phone calls, no more whispers from the kids at Sophie's school. Everything gradually grew quiet. At first, the silence felt strange, like living in a storm for so long that when it finally clears, you're stunned by the quiet. But slowly I began to love that silence. It meant one thing: we had survived. I returned to working from home, not too much, just enough, but this time I did it because I wanted to. No one was dictating or controlling me anymore. Sophie, too, slowly became a child again. No longer my little warrior, no more sneaking around with a tablet, recording nights filled with yelling. Now, she drew more. Her pictures no longer full of grays and blacks. Instead, there were blue skies, parks, and sometimes, two of us sitting on a bench, smiling wide. One evening, while I was folding laundry, Sophie came into my room. She held the small sign that once hung on her wall. "Mom, I want you to keep this." I took it. The words were still the same, the ones she had written after the trial. "Truth is brave." I looked up at her. "Why do you want me to have it?" She shrugged and smiled playfully. "Because I think you're brave too. You need it more than I do now." I laughed. A real lighthearted laugh, the kind I hadn't made naturally in what felt like forever. Time went on. Brandon, I heard he sold the mansion. His career wasn't doing so well anymore. He was still allowed to see Sophie, supervised, but she never asked to. And I didn't hate him, truly. For a long time I thought I'd spend the rest of my life hating Brandon. But when it was all over, I realized true freedom doesn't come from making others hurt, it comes from no longer letting them control your emotions. Brandon, he's just a name now, a closed chapter. A man who once defined me, but no longer does. Tonight, I sit quietly in the living room. Sophie is asleep, peacefully. No nightmares haunting her. I look around our small apartment. No expensive furniture. No oil paintings on the walls. No lavish dinners or fake toasts. Just me. Alone. And for the first time in forever, that is enough. I smile. Not the forced kind. Not the type that says I'm okay when I'm not. A real smile. The kind of smile you wear when you finally understand you are truly free. No longer the woman who was once overlooked. No longer the mother once deemed unstable. No longer the wife suffocated by sweet words laced with threats. I am Emily, a woman who broke, who stood up again, and who now chooses to live her life without needing anyone's permission. Truth is brave. And me? I am finally brave enough to move forward. So there it is. That's how someone who was once overlooked, pushed to the edge, and labeled as weak, chose to rise. Not for revenge, not to make anyone kneel, but to say, I deserve better than this. And it wasn't just Emily who was brave. A 7-year-old girl taught us the most important lesson. Truth is brave, and sometimes you have to be the first to speak it, even when the whole world turns its back on you. Now, I want to ask you something. In this story, who are you? Are you Emily, who once endured but finally chose freedom? Are you Sophie, who saw the truth and dared to reveal it? Or are you still sitting in your own darkness, wondering if you deserve to step out? I don't know where you are on your journey. But I do know this. You have the right. You are worthy. And you don't need anyone's permission to start living. If this story touched you, if even a part of you feels ready to stand up for yourself, leave a comment below. Just 3 simple words. I choose freedom. No explanations, no stories, just those words, a reminder that it's time. And so others reading alongside you will know, you are not alone anymore. Thank you for staying until the end, because sometimes just listening is the very first step toward freedom. See you in the next chapter. Stronger, clearer, more you.